So welcome everybody. We're so excited to see you. In just 1 minute, we'll be joining with James Madison from Colonial Williamsburg. So we're excited about that. My name is Curry Sautner. I'm your Chief Learning Officer from the National Constitution Center. So I'm literally yours. I'm here to help you with all things constitutional. I'm going to be helping you out in the chat today. And yes, I will be posting this recording to our live page, our pages on the internet, our recorded sessions page, as well as our YouTube channel, so you can watch later. So we're just waiting for James Madison to come right back. But as we go through today, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A and the chat box. Now, to tee up this conversation today, we are joined by our top scholar at the National Constitution Center, Jeff Rosen. Jeff, would you like to do an introduction, say hello to all the students?
Well, hi, everyone. It is great to see you. Very exciting to talk to James Madison today, and here he is. And welcome. We can call him Mr. President, or because his role as the father of the Constitution was even more significant, I think I'll call you Mr. Madison, if that's all right. Welcome, Mr. Madison.
I think we might speak on informal terms, sir, and Mr. Madison is entirely appropriate.
Thank you.
I have often said, sir, government is not like the fabled goddess of wisdom, the work of one mind. There are a great many who are quick to call me a father of this particular document which has earned so much veneration and, well, dare I say, Mr. Rosen, a great deal of controversy. But at this present moment, I'm pleased to speak of the various principles, the philosophies, and indeed the inspirations to this unique system which promises to forward this experiment of government which so much mingled blood has been spilled to secure. I thank you for this opportunity, and moreover, I am pleased to speak in this most unique of formats where, through the innovation of technology, I might transcend myself to the hearths and homes of people all across this continent of North America. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege to have this opportunity to address you, the citizens and countrymen of this unique experiment of government. Now, as my name and reputation is fairly unknown, although on some instances, Mr. Rosen, perhaps too known to the anti-federalist camp, I hope you will allow me to be the Virginian that I am and offer introduction. For myself, individually, I've had the privilege to walk with this nation every step since its inception, beginning, of course, in the old colonial capital of Williamsburg, Virginia, and yet a great deal of my labor has taken me to your Philadelphia, the freest and greatest inspirations of cities in this continent of North America. I've sat as a legislator, author, a philosopher, but equally have borne a conspicuous effort in the rearing of our federal system of government, the system of checks and balances, the separation of powers, which promises in every instance that the necessity of power may never descend into the vagrancies of corruption. My name is James Madison, at your service. Now, friends, we find ourselves once more in the midst of revolution. Revolution not of blood, not of the sword, but instead of ink, of paper. We find ourselves making history, whereby in this year of 1788, having ratified our Constitution, for the first time in America's history, the people shall elect their federal representatives by the grace of Article 1 of our Constitution. And no greater trust has ever been given to a people to honor those ideas of life, of liberty, of the pursuit of happiness. And so upon such times of question and change, I am pleased to reflect upon the various philosophies, the histories which inspired our Constitution. Equally pleased to speak with such an august gentleman as yourself, Mr. Rosen. I thank you for this audience.
Well, it is an honor to speak to you, Mr. Madison, and thank you for that eloquent introduction. It is so meaningful for you to speak to our friends through this new technology. As you so presciently wrote, technologies like the newspaper could unite our citizens in a bond of literate conversation, which would promote the deliberation that you thought was so crucial for democracy, and that's just what we're going to have today. I thought that I would begin with some questions and then turn it over to our friends. And I wanted to begin with your own words in writing, so eloquent in the Federalist Papers. We talked earlier this week about how you wrote in the Federalist 51 that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. If all men were angels, no government would be necessary. If there were no virtue in our citizens, no government would be possible. Tell us about your view of human nature and why checks and balances and separation of powers are necessary to ensure the rule of reason rather than passion.
I thank you for the question, Mr. Rosen. There are a great many of my contemporaries who view humanity in the most platonic of senses, embodying Plato's republic, that man, being instilled with virtue, inevitably should frame a society that moves towards that needle. Perhaps, Mr. Rosen, it was my education at the hands of Presbyterians. Perhaps it was my early days in Virginia witnessing the religious intolerance and persecution of the Baptists. But inherently, as I wrote, if men were angels, no system of government would be necessary. What we have witnessed instead is that inherent argument put forward by David Hume, that man, being both creatures of action and reason, find themselves compelled upon occasion to move towards their own self-interest. And now when we examine this continent of North America, we see a multiplicity of factions, a diversity of different religions, the followers of different demagogues, attributors to different parties. We see the merchantmen living simultaneously with the planter. We see the slaveholder fixed with those against the institution of slavery. And amidst all of these diversities of natural faction, we find men fixed with their own agenda and interest. Now, when we examine the history of the world, what we have seen that democratic experiments of government, rather than being conducive to law or to order, have been short in their lives and, well, sir, violent within their deaths. To such volume and to such height that the majority of the world have decided man is incapable of governing themselves, that kings and kings alone should rule. Now, what is the answer to this? To put forward the same metric in America, or to find a system whereby power can be checked, where ambition, as you said and I wrote, can be made to counteract ambition? Now, we are fortunate in this, Mr. Rosen, because we live in the luckiest age, in my opinion, that man has been offered, whereby we can sit within our individual studies, our individual libraries, our individual closets and cloisters, and with the power of the written word can travel the vast diversity of time and space. We can examine human nature not as it sits within one country, but as it exists as the whole. Make no mistake, sir. The only beginning is Genesis. Everything else is a continuation of some previous idea. Now, what it comes down to in the history of the notion of separation of powers can be found all the way from the ancient codes of Hammurabi. The great desideratum of government is to keep the many from punishing the few. This is what Justinian wrote in his great code. This is what John Locke wrote in the Social Contract. This is what Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in the Social Compact. And yet we live in an age where man truly contemplates government. And the one who truly lifted the veil on these various political theorems, particularly the notion of separation of powers, is the Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu wrote in his Spirit of Laws that wherever power in government lies within one branch, you can find only tyranny. And so from there, Montesquieu defined three separate branches of government: legislative, executive, adjudicative, each with their own separate functions. In 1776, the 13 separate states created new systems of government and embodied that idea. Virginia had a particular interest at that time because we faced a royal governor who sat as executive, as legislative, and as judiciary during the time of warfare. After dissolving our representative houses, he sat the sole power in Virginia. And so in 1776, we created branches of government, 3 in number: a bicameral legislature, an independent executive, and judiciary. Now, any who have studied our current Constitution will know full well that that sounds familiar. and yet it exists upon an entirely different scale. This inspiration came from David Hume, who talked about extending the sphere of government. You see, we have these various factions. What is the distinction of a Virginian or a Pennsylvanian, if not a difference of faction? What are the difference and multiplicities of faiths, if not a distinction of faction? And so if we recognize one of the greatest dangers in such an experiment of government is that the many will rise against the few, in extending the sphere of government, we find a separation of powers whereby the diversity of different interests counteract one another. Now, as to the separation of powers within our federal constitution, we see the intermingling of these various bodies of government, where there is not only a constitutional interest to check one another, but equally a personal interest. The House of Representatives, in accordance with Article 1 of the Constitution, being elected by the people, therefore being the more populous of branches, the more prone to faction. The United States Senate, appointed by the state legislatures, being the more deliberate body, checking the passions of the people. The President and Chief Magistrate holding over as the executor of the law, from that the arm of the body politic, while the legislature is the heart. And last, of course, the adjudicative, whose interest lies solely within the Constitution of the United States. We see, in conclusion, Mr. Rosen, not only the separation of powers, but the separation of interest and of function. If we recognize that man is an imperfect creature, then we begin to discover that in government we might utilize those imperfections to counteract your fellow man's imperfections. And in doing so, we create, not a perfect system of government, but certainly a more perfect system of government.
Thank you for that wonderful answer and for so carefully telling us about the influence of Montesquieu on your thought and also the importance of a large republic, which, as you so presciently noted, might slow down the formation of faction. In this regard, you differed from Montesquieu, who thought that you could only have republics in small communities where everyone knew each other. But I want to present you with another one of your very important insights and ask you to reflect on it. You said in Federalist 55, in all large assemblies of any number composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, you said, Athens would still have been a mob. Tell us about why you believe that the extended republic in America would slow down deliberation in a way that would inhibit the formation of faction and would ensure that reason prevails. And then perhaps tell us whether you think that the technology that we're now talking about, this internet technology, which speeds up deliberation and makes instant communication possible, is a challenge to your faith in these speed bumps and roadblocks.
Well, a remarkable question that I will answer in several parts. By your leave, first I will consult, of course, history, those Athenian city-states. Second, the justification of how an extended republican experiment of government can, in the inverse of Montesquieu's theorem, provide a greater security in the channels of democracy. And third, I will speak to the remarkable innovation that you discussed. Now, first and foremost, when we examine history, particularly the pure democracies of antiquity, what have been their fruits? When we examine the confederations of Amphictyon, of antiquity of ancient Greece, well, what we discovered was that the great democracies of Athens were built upon the passions of the people. We live even now, at this present moment, in this year of 1788, where we are ruled not by that reason which elevates our thought, the disinterest, as we said, but instead our prejudices, our fears. In ancient times, the great statesmen of Greece would gather in a place called the Areopagus. From that would engage in great debate to sway their fellow man, not out of a desire to improve matters of government, but instead to curry favor. These various individuals were referred to as demagogues, caterers to the masses who, by promises of power and safety, could sway a people towards their various end. What does Jean-Jacques Rousseau teach us of well, tranquility. It exists in dungeons, but it does not make them nice places to live. And so these various passions of a people fretful of their own power and safety led to the, well, secession of power to the hands of individuals like Philip of Macedon. Now, it's important to remember that these various ancient democracies were united not by a strong constitution, but rather instead a treaty of amity. They were a confederation very similar to we were under the Articles of Confederation. They were united for the purpose of religion and defense. They paid their tithes to the Oracle of Delphi, Delphi setting forth various rules. In times of war, they would raise their armies and fight in unison. Yet what took place in times of peace? Inevitably, those various city-states, not having a common enemy to fight, would turn their heads towards each other. The multi-headed Hydra inevitably being slain by the demigod of Greece. Meaning to wit, these democratic experiments of government fail. Man cannot be ruled by passion. Thus, I move to the notion of why an extended experiment of government, particularly one of democratic ideals, provides a greater security. I turn once more to the Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu saying the best way we can secure ideas of democracy is through a republic. I will place it in the simplest of terms. Imagine we have 13 separate horses in pasture. This is our democracy. Each horse equal under the law. And yet let us imagine for a singular moment, a coachman sits and bids those horses move forward. He may endeavor to coerce them with the whip, but inevitably those various horses will move bound their own interest. So in this equation, if democracy is 13 horses in the pasture, a republic becomes a carriage, tacking those various horses so that the path and direction might become smooth and certain. This was attempted and is attempted upon the state level, and yet still we have witnessed each state bound with their own interest. Under the Articles of Confederation, we witnessed the pervading bite of jealousy between the states. We witnessed the violation of treaties. We witnessed having to violate the Articles of Confederation to conduct the business of government. So from that, if we accept that the form of a republic functions for a people, how then shall that metric function upon a higher level to coerce and bind these states together? In that, we take the flooding torrent of democracy and we craft a canal where the path becomes smooth, short, and certain. Now in that, Mr. Rosen, I will ask this question, as perhaps you are more familiar with this technology than I am. Now, by the privilege of your innovation, we have the ability to speak with one another as if we were in the same room, yes?
Yes.
Now, from that, I must wonder what other information is available to you. Now, I have here, placed just as such, various volumes of history. Shall we fathom a day where suddenly, just as we are speaking with such immediacy over miles away, that this information should become so readily available as well? In that vein, I could see the potential to enlighten yourself to be in such a way that is unparalleled. Simultaneously, I can see those self-same passions put forward. Now, you and I, sir, have never met one another within the flesh. We know not one another for their virtues and their values, although I am familiar with your reputation, sir, and you seem to be familiar with mine. But from that, I could foresee a day where those various passions, without the ability to speak and confide face to face, should inevitably lead to that self-same vitriolic idea which leads us towards mob rule. In that vein, we find a responsibility of citizenship that has never before been seen, to use those various tools at your disposal to enlighten yourself and enlighten your fellow man, rather than giving way to the passions which have covered the ground in so much blood and led to a people both miserable and in chains.
You so eloquently, Mr. Madison, remind me and our friends of the urgent duty that all of us have to cultivate our own faculties of reason and to use these powerful new technologies for virtue rather than vice, so that the thoughtful deliberation that you made possible face to face can prevail. We have many questions from our friends, but I must ask one more question because you're teaching us so much about the rule of reason. You wrote about the need for individuals to master unreasonable passions, and you took these from the ancients, from Aristotle, passions such as anger, jealousy, remorse, and fear, and instead be guided by virtues such as temperance, humility, justice, and prudence. How in practice can our friends who are watching, who are learning at home and are eager for your guidance, how can they use their faculties of reason to master these unreasonable passions?
A very good question. Upon that, I have ever been a student of philosophy, not solely Aristotle, but Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, those who upon some degree are called the Stoics. Now, I will confide in you, I have been in poor health for the better part of my life, and so I learned at an early age to master my emotions, not solely for the purpose of my health, but for a mastery in debate. If our argument is free from any emotion, well, you should never offend your fellow man. And moreover, the various arguments put in place should inevitably come across far more as fact if there is not the bias of emotion and fear behind it. I will say I have ever been given over to a ravenous and unabatable curiosity. Before I was anything, a statesman, a scholar, an author, or a representative of the people, I was a student. The greatest way to master our reason and thus find virtue is from that to consistently enlighten oneself. There is a maxim that I have held for the better part of my life, a maxim which originally came from John Witherspoon that I have adopted for myself. It is a phrase that is in Latin, veritas non verbis magistri. This is truth, not the words of teachers. The people of America have the greatest responsibility to find truth for themselves. It is not a truth that is put forward in newspapers, not a truth that is put forward by any individual who endeavors to give you their truth. Your conscience is your greatest property. And in doing so, in finding reason and logic, we owe a responsibility to enrich ourselves, to honor the various ideas of our past, but as well as the experiences of our fellow man. This is how the people of America innovate. It has ever been the pride and boast of America that while we respect our history, we do not suffer a blind veneration to antiquity over the lessons of our own experience. The greatest measure by which we do this, the greatest virtue that we can hold, is to enlighten ourselves. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, Mr. Rosen. If a people wish to govern themselves, they must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. That, in my opinion, should be the best measure whereby we can be ruled by reason. And indeed, it was that reason that allowed our Constitution to exceed the various personalities who, by catering to man's fear, endeavored to ensure the Constitution never passed. Our government and its great victories were won by reason. And so too, in my own opinion, will it continue to be so.
Thank you so much, Mr. Madison, for that invaluable advice. Friends, you heard Mr. Madison say that if a people want to govern themselves, we must arm ourselves with the reason that knowledge brings. And he also talked about the need to be governed not by the words of teachers, but by truth. And he recommended some of the philosophers that had inspired him, including Marcus Aurelius's Meditations and the works of Seneca, as ways of achieving that self-mastery of our passions so that we can be guided by reason. And I hope that all of you are as inspired by his advice as I am. Okay, Curry, it's time to take questions from our friends. There's so many great ones. Why don't you turn them over to Mr. Madison?
Sure, there are so many great ones. And across the board, any reading list, please let us know, because that has been over and over again. What are you reading? What are you reading? What would you suggest? So I have those two that Jeff just repeated and a few others, but anything else as we go through. Lots of great questions here, but I really do think that Bonnie's question gets at some of the, we love to hear Mr. Madison, we love to hear his stories, we love to believe in it, but there's also this question about Madison's choices in his life. So Bonnie's question is, how could you tolerate slavery, and how do you reconcile slavery with the lofty vision and emerging nation?
Miss Bonnie, I thank you for that question, and of course for your candor in it. You ask me how I justify the masterpiece of circumlocution that is the institution of slavery. I say the answer to that is quite simple, and yet the explanation for it is not. The answer is how I justify it, I do not. There is no measure by any who love liberty and say America should stand for the rights of human nature to justify those selfsame ends. Now, upon that, Miss Bonnie, to explain that answer, I should first and foremost, to wit, speak to the genesis of slavery in America. Second, how it is justified. And third, how we might see its end. Now, from there in 1619, the first representative democratic body in North America met. This was at the former capital of Virginia in Jamestown, whereby elected representatives conducted the business of government, the first English-speaking assembly in the New World. A great victory for a new land. The next month, the first Africans came here for the purposes of servitude. And yet it did not begin as slavery as we know it, no. Instead, it was indenture, the same facet which was carrying through. And yet, through a series of generations, passed from grandfather to grandson, slowly the institution of slavery for Virginia became a condition whereby mother would pass the condition to child. The slow disenfranchisement of a people. Now, how do we justify it? Well, at the Constitutional Convention, it was justified that those individuals sitting in that state of slavery were property. This is a fallacy, Miss Bonnie. You cannot find property in men. Now, we've seen the mere distinction of color made in this enlightened age, the justification for the most oppressive dominion of man over man. My family holds over 100 people in this consistent circumstance. Before I could consent to own them, at my baptism, I received some 10 individuals as a baptism gift from my grandmother, a babe, a child born into the institution and raised within the same. And yet I'm not so blind, so born of privilege to not see the contradiction. Now, I will say I have endeavored to distance myself from the institution of slavery. I brought a manservant with me to Philadelphia during my first term in Congress, a man by the name of Billy, as his name was. When Pennsylvania passed a gradual manumission law whereby after a period of 7 years, every enslaved person would be free, it was Billy's wish that he find himself sold, something which I did. This was not my enslaved individual to sell, but my father's. My father, being furious, I wrote to him and said, how can I fault him for coveting that freedom where so much mingled blood has been spilled to secure? Now, this does not make me by any metric a saint. I will say I have both benefited and profited from the institution and therefore am no better. Now, there are some who will say that the enslaved upon a property live in a state of childlike wonder, of happiness, the closest to nature. And I must wonder if that is the case, why do they run? And then we move to how we might find ourselves rid of it. We see various states pass gradual manumission laws. Pennsylvania has done so. Virginia has put forward a method whereby, if you can afford their care, you might manumit people. And yet, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, should you free an individual formerly enslaved, that enslaved person has 6 months to leave the Commonwealth. Suddenly, they're faced with a decision to reside in the place that they have always called home in bondage, or to venture into a wilderness as a free individual, leaving behind family, friends, and any connection that they have made. Now, that choice resides with them, but it is a difficult choice all the same. So let us imagine for a moment, Miss Bonnie, that we end the institution of slavery. Let us say we find a universal method whereby we might end that institution. The greater question staked is, what then do we do with the prejudice? It was the prejudice that justified the institution, was it not? So at the end of this institution, if we do not abolish that selfsame prejudice, whereby one sect of society is taught to be superior and the other subordinate, how soon before a slavery in miniature or mirror should come to arise, whereby a people continue to endeavor to disfranchise another. It goes back to the selfsame difference of faction, and indeed the end of government, to keep the many from punishing the few. I will say, Miss Bonnie, I have no solution to it. Only the genuine hope that if a people are enlightened, we may endeavor to move forward. We have said that all men are created equal. We have said all nations wish to be so. And yet still we have seen slavery play a common role in the human race. Asleep, people have been surprised, ignorant, people have been deceived and divided. They have had the yoke put upon them. So then in abolishing the institution of slavery, it takes the responsibility of a people to instead be awakened, enlightened, and united. It is my hope that perhaps one day we should see that.
That is an unbelievably fantastic response. Bonnie, thank you so much for asking that question. And we want to sneak in one more question, and it is a half an hour long, but one more from Dolores. And I think it's a great way to wrap up so much that you have taught us. What advice would Mr. Madison give to individuals today? So sending yourself into the future of what we as members of our society, members looking as a part of we the people, playing a role in the Constitution and the system, what can we do to contribute to our society and to our Constitution?
There should be, I think, two pieces. The first, something from Federalist 14, which I return to often. And the second advice that I hope should be offered is one issued from the tomb. The first should be, as this is a year of great change and election, to hearken not to the unnatural voice which tells you the people of America, knit together as they are by so many cords of affection, cannot be members of the same family, cannot be the mutual guardians of their mutual happiness, and cannot be children of one flourishing empire. Hearken not to the voice which says that this system is a novelty in the political world, that it has no place in the wildest of projectors or rashest of intents. No. Shut your ears to that unhallowed language and shut your hearts to the poison that it conveys. And lastly, the advice nearest to my heart and deepest in my convictions is that this union of the states be cherished and perpetuated, that the open enemy of it be regarded as the Pandora with her box opened, and the secret one as the serpent creeping with its deadly wills into paradise. Now, lastly, I will say the happy union of these states is a wonder. The Constitution is a miracle, and their example, the hope of freedom and liberty throughout the world. It has been my avowed pleasure speaking with you today.
I cannot thank you so much. This was such a wonderful way to end this week, looking at the Constitution, at separation of powers, and the roles of the different branches, and then how we, the people, play a huge part in that. This was a fantastic, fun Friday session. I appreciate this so much. Jeff, would you like to bring us home?
Yes, on behalf of the National Constitution Center and on behalf of all of our friends who are watching, Mr. Madison, I want to thank you most sincerely for having inspired us about the urgent importance of being governed by reason rather than passion, being devoted to the miracle that is the Constitution, and expressing our continued fidelity to the Union of the United States of America. Thank you very much indeed for your great service to the United States, and have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you, sir. You as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. We will see you next week in class. And Mr. Madison, thank you. It was an honor having you today. We really appreciate it.